Daily life in ancient Pompeii unfolded in steady, predictable patterns. The city existed as a modest Roman settlement near the Bay of Naples, and its inhabitants followed routines shaped by the climate, social structure, and practical necessities of the time. Most people in Pompeii lived ordinary lives centered around work, family, and community obligations. The morning hours began early for most residents of the city. Sunlight filtered through small windows and open doorways, gradually illuminating the interiors of homes built from volcanic stone and plaster. The air inside these structures felt cool in the early hours, carrying the faint smell of olive oil lamps that had burned through the night. People rose from their sleeping arrangements, which varied depending on social standing, but generally consisted of simple wooden frames with woven rope or leather supports covered by wool blankets and linen sheets. The wealthiest families owned elaborate bronze bed frames with decorative elements, while poorer households made do with straw mattresses placed directly on the floor or on basic wooden platforms. The structure of Roman homes in Pompeii reflected a practical approach to daily living. Most dwellings followed a basic design that centered around an atrium, an open courtyard area that allowed light and air to circulate throughout the interior spaces. Rainwater collected in a shallow pool called an impluvium, positioned directly beneath an opening in the roof known as a compluvium. This architectural feature served both aesthetic and functional purposes, providing households with a source of water for washing and other domestic tasks. The walls of these homes were typically covered in painted plaster, with colors ranging from deep reds and yellows to earth tones and blacks, though these decorative elements were more common in wealthier households. Floors in modest homes consisted of packed earth or simple stone, while more affluent residents enjoyed elaborate mosaic designs created from tiny colored tiles arranged in geometric patterns or scenes from mythology. During these early hours, the sounds of the city gradually increased in volume and complexity. Wooden shutters opened along the street fronts of shops and workshops, creating a rhythmic series of creaks and thuds that echoed through narrow lanes. The voices of vendors began to call out their wares, though these announcements remained measured and routine rather than urgent or dramatic. Footsteps on stone-paved streets added to the ambient noise, along with the occasional rattle of carts and the distant sounds of animals being moved or fed. The temperature in these morning hours remained comfortable, with Mediterranean breezes carrying the scent of the sea, mixed with smoke from cooking fires and the earthy smell of the volcanic soil that surrounded the city. Most Pompeian residents ate a simple morning meal if they ate anything at all during these early hours. This first meal typically consisted of bread, perhaps dipped in wine or olive oil, sometimes accompanied by cheese or olives. Bread represented a staple food for all social classes, though its quality varied considerably. Wealthy households enjoyed fine white bread made from refined wheat flour, while poorer families consumed coarser varieties made from barley or mixed grains that contained more texture and darker coloring. The bread was typically purchased from commercial bakeries rather than made at home, as most private residences lacked the large stone ovens necessary for proper bread production. These bakeries operated throughout the city, their distinctive round millstones turned by donkeys or slaves who walked in endless circles throughout the day, grinding grain into flour. The daily routine for most Pompeians involved specific types of labor determined by their social position and occupation. Merchants opened their shops along the main streets, arranging their goods on wooden counters or shelves. These establishments sold a wide variety of items, from pottery and metalwork to cloth and imported goods brought by ship from distant provinces of the empire. The shops themselves were typically small, often consisting of a single room that opened directly onto the street, with living quarters for the merchant's family located in rooms above or behind the commercial space. Artisans and craftspeople worked in similar establishments, their workshops filled with the tools and materials specific to their trades. The sound of hammering metal, the scrape of chisels on stone, and the rhythmic clacking of looms created a constant background noise in certain districts of the city. The Forum served as the central gathering place for Pompeii's residents, a large open square surrounded by important public buildings, temples, and covered walkways called porticos. People moved through this space throughout the day, conducting business, meeting acquaintances, and observing public proceedings. The stone paving of the forum reflected sunlight during midday hours, creating a bright and exposed environment that offered little shade. The columns of the surrounding porticos cast long shadows that moved slowly across the ground as the day progressed, providing narrow strips of relief from the direct sun. The air in this open space carried the voices of many conversations, though individual words rarely stood out clearly from the general murmur of crowd noise. Public buildings in Pompeii reflected Roman architectural principles and served various civic and religious functions. The Basilica, a large rectangular building near the Forum, housed legal proceedings and commercial transactions. The interior of this structure featured rows of columns that supported a high roof, creating a cool and somewhat dim space where sound echoed softly off the stone surfaces. Temples dedicated to various gods stood at prominent locations throughout the city. These religious structures followed traditional designs, with columned fronts and interior chambers that housed statues of the deities to whom they were dedicated. Citizens visited these temples to make offerings and fulfill religious obligations, these activities representing routine aspects of daily life rather than extraordinary events. The presence of water represented an important feature of daily life in Pompeii. The city benefited from an aqueduct system that brought fresh water from mountain sources, distributing it through lead pipes to public fountains, wealthy private homes, and the various bath complexes scattered throughout the urban area. Public fountains stood at regular intervals along the streets, their stone basins constantly filled with flowing water. People gathered at these fountains to fill clay vessels for household use, the sound of water splashing into containers and flowing through the fountain's spouts, creating a continuous, gentle background noise. The water itself appeared clear and cool, though it carried a slight mineral taste from its journey through the stone channels of the aqueduct. The public baths represented one of the most characteristic features of Roman urban life, and Pompeii contained several such establishments of varying sizes. These complexes served social, hygienic, and recreational functions, their heated rooms and pools attracting visitors throughout the day. The typical bath sequence involved moving through a series of rooms with different temperature levels. Visitors entered through a changing area called the apoditorum, where they removed their clothing and stored it in wall niches or handed it to attendants. From there, they progressed to the tepidarium, a warm room designed to prepare the body for the higher heat of the caldarium, a hot room with heated floors and walls that induced sweating. After spending time in these heated spaces, bathers moved to the frigidarium, a cool room containing a cold water pool for a refreshing plunge that closed the pores and invigorated the body. The atmosphere inside the bath complexes combined dampness, warmth, and a particular smell of heated stone and bodies. Sound echoed off the curved ceilings and tiled walls, creating a reverberating effect that made conversations and other noises blend together into an indistinct hum. Light entered through small windows and openings in the roof, filtering through the steam that rose from the heated pools and settling in soft, diffused patterns on the wet surfaces of the floors and walls. The sensation of warmth permeated these spaces, generated by sophisticated heating systems that circulated hot air through hollow spaces beneath the floors and within the walls. These systems burned wood constantly, the furnaces tended by slaves who remained largely invisible to the bathing public, but whose labor made the entire experience possible. Beyond the public spaces in commercial districts, residential neighborhoods stretched throughout Pompeii in a somewhat irregular pattern, determined by the natural terrain and centuries of gradual development. These areas contained the homes of families from various social levels, though certain districts housed concentrations of wealthier citizens, while others were characterized by more modest dwellings. The streets themselves varied in width, with some main thoroughfares wide enough to accommodate cart traffic, while many smaller lanes barely permitted two people to pass each other comfortably. The stone paving showed signs of wear in heavily trafficked areas, with ruts worn into the surface by countless cartwheels over many years. Raised stepping stones placed at intervals allowed pedestrians to cross streets without walking through the mud, water, and various waste materials that collected in the roadways, especially during rainy periods. Meals during the middle of the day tended to be light and informal affairs for most Pompeians. Many people purchased prepared food from thermopolia, commercial establishments that served hot food and drink to customers. These establishments featured distinctive counters with large ceramic vessels set into the stonework, these containers holding various prepared dishes such as soups, stews, and wine. The food served at these places provided convenient and affordable options for those who lacked cooking facilities at home or preferred not to prepare their own meals. The smell of cooking food drifted from these establishments into the surrounding streets, mixing with other urban odors to create the characteristic scent profile of the city during daylight hours. The social structure of Pompeian society created clear divisions between different groups of people, though members of these various classes interacted regularly in public spaces and commercial contexts. The wealthiest residents, many of whom derived their income from agricultural estates in the surrounding countryside or from successful commercial ventures, occupied the largest and most elaborately decorated homes. These individuals held positions of civic responsibility, serving as magistrates and officials in the city government, organizing public entertainments, and contributing to the construction and maintenance of public buildings and amenities. The middle strata of society consisted of merchants, skilled craftspeople, and moderately successful business people who enjoyed comfortable, though not luxurious, living conditions. Below them existed a larger population of laborers, service workers, and the urban poor who occupied the smallest and least comfortable housing, often living in cramped rooms above shops or in purpose-built apartment structures. Slavery represented a fundamental aspect of Roman society, and Pompeii contained a significant enslaved population that performed a wide range of labor. Household slaves carried out domestic tasks such as cooking, cleaning, carrying water, and attending to their owners' personal needs. Commercial and industrial slaves worked in workshops, bakeries, and other productive establishments, their labor generating wealth for their owners. The lives of enslaved people varied considerably depending on their skills, their owners' temperaments, and the specific nature of their work, though they all shared the fundamental lack of legal personhood and autonomy that defined their status. The presence of these workers remained constant throughout the city, though their activities often went unnoticed by free citizens who had become accustomed to the system and took it for granted as a natural feature of their world. The afternoon hours brought a gradual decrease in the intensity of commercial activity. The heat reached its peak during these hours, particularly in the summer months, and many people sought shade and rest during this period. Shops sometimes closed temporarily, their shutters pulled shut against the bright sunlight and warmth. The streets became quieter, with fewer people moving through the public areas. Those who remained outside moved slowly, staying close to the shaded areas provided by building overhangs and covered walkways. The stone surfaces of buildings and pavements radiated absorbed heat, creating an environment where even the air seemed to shimmer slightly in the most exposed locations.
Later in the afternoon, as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, the city gradually returned to life. The temperature moderated somewhat, and the harsh glare of midday softened into a more golden light that cast longer shadows and gave the city a different visual character. People emerged from their homes and returned to their shops and workplaces. The streets filled again with pedestrians, and the sounds of conversation and commerce resumed. This period marked the time when many citizens attended to personal business, visited the baths if they had not done so earlier, or simply spent time socializing with friends and acquaintances in the various public spaces available throughout the city. The main meal of the day typically occurred in the evening hours. For wealthy households, this meal represented the most elaborate and socially significant eating occasion, often involving multiple courses and extended dining periods. These dinners took place in a room called the triclinium, furnished with 3 dining couches arranged in a U-shape around a central table. Diners reclined on these couches in positions that allowed them to reach the food while maintaining a relaxed posture that Romans considered appropriate for leisurely eating. The meal might include multiple courses featuring various meats, fish, vegetables, bread, and fruit, accompanied by wine that had been diluted with water according to Roman custom. Slaves served these meals, bringing dishes from the kitchen and clearing away empty plates while remaining as unobtrusive as possible. For less wealthy families, evening meals were simpler affairs, typically consisting of porridge made from grain, vegetables, and perhaps small amounts of meat or fish when available and affordable. These meals were consumed while seated at simple wooden tables or, in the poorest households, while sitting on the floor. The cooking occurred over braziers or small hearths, the smoke from these fires escaping through windows, doors, or openings in the roof. The smell of cooking food filled the narrow streets of residential neighborhoods during these evening hours, creating an olfactory landscape that varied from block to block depending on what different families were preparing. As darkness fell, the character of the city changed considerably. Most people remained in their homes during the night hours, as Roman cities lacked public lighting and the streets became difficult and potentially dangerous to navigate after sunset. Those who did venture out carried oil lamps or torches, their flickering light creating small pools of illumination that moved through the darkness. The Night Watch, groups of men responsible for maintaining order and responding to fires or other emergencies, made regular rounds through the streets, their footsteps and occasional calls providing reassurance to those who heard them from behind closed doors. Inside homes, the evening hours passed quietly. Families sat together in rooms lit by oil lamps, the small flames casting moving shadows on the walls and creating a warm, dim atmosphere. These lamps consisted of clay or bronze vessels filled with olive oil, with a fiber wick that burned with a small, steady flame. The light they provided remained limited, sufficient for conversation and simple tasks, but not bright enough for detailed work or reading. The smell of burning oil permeated these interior spaces, mixing with other household odors to create the distinctive scent of Roman domestic life. Conversations during these hours tended to cover the events of the day, family matters, and plans for the following day, though periods of comfortable silence were equally common. Sleep eventually claimed the residents of Pompeii as the night deepened. People retired to their sleeping areas, which varied considerably in comfort depending on household wealth. The quiet of the night settled over the city, broken only by occasional sounds such as dogs barking, the cry of a night watchman, or the distant noises from the harbor where ships might still be loading or unloading cargo. The stone structures of the city retained some of the day's warmth during the early night hours, though the temperature gradually dropped as the night progressed, particularly during the cooler months. The daily routine described here represented a pattern that repeated itself endlessly, with only minor variations to mark one day from another. Religious festivals, public games, and market days provided occasional breaks in this rhythm, but for the most part, life in Pompeii proceeded according to well-established patterns that had developed over generations. The city existed as a living community where thousands of people pursued their individual lives within a shared urban environment, their activities interconnected through economic relations, family ties, and the common experiences of living in a Roman provincial city during the first century of the Common Era. This simple routine of daily existence was an ordinary reality for the people who called Pompeii their home.
Life in a medieval village during the 14th century followed patterns determined by seasons and agricultural necessity. Most people in these settlements lived as peasants who worked the land surrounding their small cluster of homes, their daily routines shaped by the demands of farming and the social structure of the manorial system. The village existed as a largely self-contained community where generations of families occupied the same plots of land and followed the same basic patterns of life that their ancestors had established centuries before. The physical layout of a typical medieval village reflected practical considerations rather than any formal planning. Houses clustered along a main track or around a central common area, with paths branching off toward individual plots and the surrounding fields. These dwellings were constructed primarily from locally available materials, with frames of oak or other sturdy timber supporting walls made from wattle and daub, a combination of woven wooden strips covered with a mixture of clay, straw, and animal dung that dried into a reasonably solid surface. The roofs consisted of thatch, thick layers of bundled straw or reed that provided insulation and kept out most rain, though they required regular maintenance and replacement as the materials gradually deteriorated. The entire structure rested on a foundation of stone or compacted earth, with floors made from packed dirt that became hard and smooth through constant use. Inside these homes, the living space remained quite limited, typically consisting of a single large room that served all domestic purposes.
A central hearth provided warmth and a place for cooking, though it lacked a proper chimney, so smoke simply rose toward the roof and escaped through gaps in the thatch or through a hole left specifically for this purpose. The interior air consequently carried a permanent smell of wood smoke, which permeated the walls, the few pieces of furniture, and the clothing of the inhabitants. Light entered through small openings in the walls, these apertures covered with wooden shutters that could be closed against rain and cold, but which, when shut, left the interior quite dark. At night, or during overcast days, the only illumination came from the fire itself or occasionally from rushlights, simple torches made by dipping dried rushes in animal fat that burned with a dim, smoky flame. The furnishings in these homes remained sparse and functional. Most families owned a wooden table, rough benches or stools for sitting, and perhaps a chest for storing the few valuable items they possessed. Sleeping arrangements typically consisted of straw mattresses or simple pallets placed directly on the floor or on low wooden platforms built against the walls. Wealthier peasant families might own an actual bed frame, though this represented a significant luxury. Woolen blankets provided warmth during cold nights, their rough texture and earthy smell familiar aspects of daily life. The family's cooking pots, usually made from clay or iron, hung near the hearth or rested on simple wooden shelves. Wooden bowls, cups, and spoons served for eating, with most families sharing these implements rather than each person having individual utensils. The agricultural year governed the rhythm of village life, each season bringing specific tasks that required completion before the next phase of the cycle could begin. Spring marked the time for plowing and planting, when the fields that had lain fallow through the winter needed to be broken up and prepared for crops. The men of the village worked these fields together, their iron-tipped wooden plows pulled by teams of oxen that moved slowly through the heavy soil, creating long furrows that would receive the seeds. The sound of these plow teams moving through the fields carried across the landscape, the voices of the men directing the animals mixing with the creaking of wooden implements and the soft thud of hooves on earth. The air during these spring days carried the rich smell of turned soil, along with the fresher sense of new grass and early wildflowers that grew along the margins of the cultivated areas. Women and children participated in the planting itself, walking behind the plow teams and dropping seeds into the prepared furrows at regular intervals, then using their feet or simple wooden tools to cover the seeds with soil. This work proceeded methodically rather than quickly, as rushing would result in uneven planting that could reduce the eventual harvest. The seeds themselves had been carefully stored from the previous year's crop, with the best grains set aside for this purpose, while lesser quality grain went to feeding the family or fulfilling obligations to the lord of the manor. The fields received plantings of various crops depending on the crop rotation system followed in that particular village, with wheat and barley representing the most important grains, supplemented by oats, rye, peas, beans, and other vegetables that would mature at different times throughout the growing season. Summer brought long days of tending the growing crops, which required regular attention to ensure a successful harvest. Weeding represented a constant task, as unwanted plants competed with the crops for nutrients and water. Women and children spent many hours moving through the fields, pulling out these invasive plants by hand and carrying them away to be composted or fed to animals. The work remained tedious and repetitive, conducted under the direct sun that beat down on the exposed fields. The temperature during summer afternoons could become quite warm, particularly during the height of the season, and workers took breaks in whatever shade they could find, often resting beneath the scattered trees that marked field boundaries or near the edges of the village where buildings provided some relief from the direct sunlight. The fields themselves presented a patchwork appearance during the growing season, with different crops at various stages of development creating a varied visual landscape. The wheat and barley grew tall and golden as they approached maturity, their heads heavy with grain that swayed in the breeze. The vegetable plots showed different shades of green, from the pale leaves of young peas to the darker foliage of bean plants. Birds moved through these fields constantly, searching for seeds and insects, their calls providing a background sound that changed with the time of day. Morning and evening brought particularly active periods of birdsong, while the middle hours of the day tended to be quieter except for the steady buzz of insects moving among the plants.
The harvest season in late summer and early autumn represented the most critical and demanding period of the entire year. The successful gathering of the crops determined whether the village would have adequate food to survive the coming winter and enough seed grain for the next year's planting. Everyone in the village participated in this work, from the youngest children capable of helping to the oldest members of the community who could still perform useful tasks. The cutting of grain required careful timing, as waiting too long risked loss from bad weather or animals, while harvesting too early meant the grain had not fully matured and would yield less flour when ground. When the time came, teams of workers moved through the fields with sickles, curved iron blades mounted on wooden handles that allowed them to cut through the thick stalks of grain with rhythmic sweeping motions. The sound of many sickles cutting through grain created a distinctive rustling noise that filled the harvest fields, accompanied by the voices of workers calling to each other and the occasional song or chant that helped maintain the rhythm of the work. The cut grain fell in organized rows behind the cutters, where other workers gathered it into bundles called sheaves, which they tied with twisted straw and propped upright in small groups to dry. The stubble left behind in the harvested fields stood sharp and dry, crunching underfoot as people moved through the area. The smell of cut grain, sweet and dusty, hung heavy in the air during these harvest weeks, mixing with the scent of dry earth and the sweat of the laborers. Once the grain had dried sufficiently, it needed to be transported to the village and then threshed to separate the edible kernels from the chaff and straw. This work took place on prepared threshing floors, hard-packed areas where workers used wooden flails to beat the dried grain, the rhythmic impact of these tools creating a steady thumping sound that could be heard throughout the village during the threshing season. The separated grain then required winnowing, a process of tossing it in the air so that the lighter chaff blew away while the heavier kernels fell back down to be collected. This winnowing often occurred on windy days when the natural breeze assisted in the separation process, and the sight of workers throwing grain into the air created a distinctive visual element in the village landscape during this period. The relationship between the villagers and the lord of the manor formed a central organizing principle of medieval rural life. The lord, whether a noble, knight, or institution such as a monastery, held legal control over the land and the people who worked it. In exchange for their right to farm specific plots and live in the village, the peasants owed various obligations to their lord. These included working a certain number of days each week on the lord's own agricultural lands, called the domain, which produced crops that belonged entirely to the lord rather than being shared with the workers. Additional obligations included providing labor for special projects such as building maintenance, road repair, or other work as required. Peasants also paid various fees and rents, sometimes in money but more commonly in kind, delivering portions of their harvest, eggs from their chickens, or other produce to the lord's agents. The manor house or castle where the lord resided stood apart from the village proper, often on elevated ground or otherwise positioned to command a view of the surrounding lands. This structure, built more substantially than peasant dwellings from stone or high-quality timber, represented the physical center of manorial authority. The lord's representatives, including a steward or bailiff who managed day-to-day affairs and collected rents and obligations, interacted regularly with the villagers. These officials maintained records of what each family owed and ensured that obligations were fulfilled, their presence serving as a constant reminder of the hierarchical nature of medieval rural society. The village church represented another central institution in 14th century rural life, serving both religious and social functions. The church building itself, typically constructed from stone with a wooden roof, stood as the most substantial and permanent structure in the village, its size and solidity contrasting sharply with the modest homes surrounding it. Inside, the air remained cool and slightly damp, carrying the distinct smell of old stone, candle wax, and incense. Small windows, sometimes containing colored glass in wealthier parishes, allowed limited light to enter, creating an interior atmosphere that felt removed from the everyday world outside.
The priest who served the church provided the only regular contact most villagers had with the wider institution of the medieval church, conducting services, administering sacraments, and serving as a source of spiritual guidance and authority. Sunday services represented the primary regular gathering of the entire village community. People arrived at the church dressed in their best clothing, which for most peasants meant the same garments they wore for work, but cleaned and mended as well as possible. The service itself followed a familiar pattern that had been repeated weekly throughout their entire lives, the Latin words of the liturgy incomprehensible to most attendees, but nonetheless meaningful through long association and tradition. The congregation stood for most of the service, as pews were rare in medieval village churches, and the combination of standing, the cool air, and the priest's voice created a particular atmosphere that marked this time as different from ordinary daily experience. After the service, people often lingered outside the church, exchanging news and conducting informal community business in the churchyard before returning to their homes. Daily meals in peasant households followed simple and repetitive patterns, with the available food varying by season, but generally consisting of basic staples supplemented by whatever could be grown in household gardens or gathered from common lands. Bread formed the foundation of the diet, consumed at nearly every meal, though the quality and type varied with social status and the time of year. Most peasants ate bread made from a mixture of grains, often including barley, rye, and oats along with wheat, the resulting loaves dense and dark with a coarse texture. This bread was typically baked in a communal oven, as most individual households lacked their own baking facilities, and the process of preparing and baking bread represented a significant weekly task for the women of the village. Pottage, a thick soup or stew made from whatever ingredients were available, represented another dietary staple. This dish simmered for hours over the hearth fire, the iron pot hanging from a hook or resting on stones at the edge of the flames. The base typically consisted of water or thin broth flavored with vegetables, grains, and occasionally small amounts of meat or salt pork when available. Onions, leeks, beans, peas, cabbage, and root vegetables all found their way into the pottage pot, creating a meal that provided warmth and basic nutrition. The smell of cooking pottage filled peasant homes during meal preparation times, the earthy aroma of vegetables and grain mixing with wood smoke to create a characteristic scent of medieval domestic life.
Ale represented the common drink for all members of the household, including children, as the brewing process made it safer than drinking water directly from wells or streams. The ale produced in medieval villages remained quite different from modern beer, generally consumed when still young and somewhat cloudy, with a lower alcohol content and a slightly sour, yeasty flavor. Women typically handled the brewing process, using barley malt, water, and various herbs for flavoring in place of hops, which had not yet become standard in English brewing. The brewing cycle provided a regular rhythm to household work, as ale needed to be produced frequently to maintain an adequate supply for the family's needs. The autumn months brought additional specific tasks beyond the grain harvest. Fruits from village orchards required picking and either consuming fresh during the brief period when this was possible, or preserving through drying for use during the winter months. Apples and pears represented the most common tree fruits, while berries could be gathered from hedgerows and wild areas. Nut gathering also occurred during this season, with hazelnuts, walnuts, and chestnuts collected and stored. These gathering activities involved the entire family, with children particularly active in this work, as their smaller size allowed them to reach into thick bushes and climb trees more easily than adults. The autumn air carried the scent of ripening fruit and the earthy smell of fallen leaves, while the temperatures began to cool from summer's warmth, signaling the approaching change of seasons. Winter brought a significant shift in the pattern of daily life. The agricultural work that dominated the warmer months ceased almost entirely, leaving people with more time spent indoors, but also creating the challenge of surviving on stored food until spring arrived. Homes became both refuges and prisons, offering protection from cold and wet weather, but also confining families to small, dark spaces for extended periods.
The central hearth burned constantly during winter months, its fire carefully maintained as the source of both warmth and cooking heat. Families huddled close to this fire during the coldest periods, their activities limited to essential tasks and simple indoor work, such as repairing tools, making or mending clothing, and other maintenance activities that could be performed in the limited light and space. The winter diet relied heavily on preserved foods from the previous growing season. Dried peas and beans, stored grain, salted or smoked meat from animals slaughtered in late autumn, and root vegetables kept in storage all contributed to the meals during this lean period. Fresh food became increasingly scarce as winter progressed, and the quality and quantity of available food declined until the arrival of spring brought new growth and renewed plenty. The period just before the spring harvest, when stored food ran lowest, represented the hardest time of year, often remembered in later generations as the hungry gap, when even modest households might face genuine food shortage. Daily routines during winter necessarily adapted to the reduced daylight hours and harsh weather. People rose later and retired earlier, following the natural cycle of light and darkness more closely than during the longer days of summer. Work that needed to be done outdoors, such as tending to animals, gathering firewood, or fetching water, required completion during the limited hours of daylight. Animals sheltered in small byres attached to or near the main dwelling, their body heat providing additional warmth to the human living space, while also requiring daily attention for feeding and cleaning. The sounds and smells of these animals, typically including a cow or ox, perhaps a pig, chickens, and maybe a goat or sheep, formed a constant presence in winter life. Evening hours in all seasons passed in similar ways across most peasant households. The family gathered around the hearth after the day's work concluded, perhaps eating a final light meal before sleeping. Conversation during these evening hours covered immediate family matters, plans for the next day's work, and the occasional story or memory shared among family members. Some households owned a few chickens that roosted inside during cold weather, their quiet clucking and occasional fluttering adding to the domestic sounds of the evening. The flickering light from the fire created moving shadows on the walls, and the warmth radiating from the hearth competed with the cold air seeping through gaps in the walls and roof. Gradually, as the fire burned lower and people grew tired from the day's labor, the household settled into sleep, their bodies arranged on the floor or in sleeping spaces around the perimeter of the room, wrapped in whatever blankets and coverings they possessed. The cycle of seasons and agricultural tasks repeated itself endlessly, each year bringing the same basic sequence of activities that had been followed for generations. Individual years might vary in their specific conditions, with some harvests better or worse than others depending on weather patterns, but the fundamental structure of life remained constant. Children grew up learning these patterns from their earliest years, gradually assuming more responsible roles in the household's work until they eventually established their own families and continued the same routines. Old people who could no longer perform heavy physical labor shifted to lighter tasks, such as tending small children, performing simple repairs, or other work that still contributed to the household while acknowledging their reduced physical capabilities. Religious festivals and holy days provided periodic breaks in the agricultural routine, offering structured occasions for rest, celebration, and communal gathering. These events followed the church calendar, with major feasts such as Christmas, Easter, and various saints' days observed through special services, better food when possible, and temporary suspension of regular work. These celebrations created memorable occasions in what was otherwise a repetitive and unchanging pattern of existence, offering people brief opportunities for communal joy, special foods, and freedom from ordinary labor. The anticipation of these festivals and the memories of past celebrations provided mental relief from the monotony of daily life and gave structure to people's sense of time passing. This pattern of medieval village life in the 14th century represented a world that had existed for centuries before and would continue with only minor changes for several more centuries to follow. The people who lived within this system generally knew no other way of life, as most never traveled more than a few miles from their birthplace and had limited contact with the wider world beyond their immediate locality. Their days passed in hard physical labor, close family ties, and deep integration with natural cycles and agricultural necessity. This simple, repetitive routine of daily existence in the medieval countryside was an ordinary reality for the vast majority of people living during this historical period.
Farm life in 17th century rural England followed rhythms established by agricultural necessity and seasonal change. Most people in the countryside lived in small farming communities scattered across the landscape, their daily existence shaped by the practical requirements of working the land and maintaining households within a social structure that had evolved gradually over many generations. The pattern of life remained largely predictable, with each season bringing specific tasks that needed completion before the cycle could continue into the next phase of the agricultural year. The physical appearance of the English countryside during this period reflected centuries of human settlement and agricultural use. Fields of various sizes spread across the rolling landscape, their boundaries marked by hedgerows, stone walls, or wooden fencing, depending on local materials and traditions. These enclosed fields represented a more organized approach to land use than had been common in earlier centuries, with individual farmers holding clear rights to specific parcels of land, rather than working in the open field system that had characterized medieval agriculture. The hedgerows themselves served multiple purposes, providing boundaries between properties, offering shelter for livestock, and creating habitats for birds and small animals whose presence added to the ambient sounds and movements of the rural environment. Farm buildings clustered together to form small hamlets and isolated farmsteads, their construction reflecting local building traditions and available materials. In areas where stone was plentiful, houses featured walls of local limestone or sandstone, often covered with a layer of whitewash that gave them a clean appearance when freshly applied, but which gradually weathered to show the underlying stone. In regions where timber remained more readily available, houses continued to be built with wooden frames filled in with wattle and daub or brick. The timber beams often left exposed on the exterior in patterns that created distinctive visual characteristics. Roofs typically consisted of thatch, though slate or tile became increasingly common in wealthier areas or on more substantial buildings such as manor houses and churches. The interiors of farming households in the 17th century showed some advancement from medieval conditions while still remaining quite basic by modern standards. Most farmhouses now contained several rooms rather than a single multi-purpose space, with the main hall or keeping room serving as the primary living area where cooking and much of daily life occurred. A large fireplace dominated one wall of this room, its stone or brick construction supporting a chimney that carried smoke outside rather than allowing it to fill the interior space, as had been common in earlier periods. This improvement in ventilation made homes significantly more comfortable, though the smell of wood smoke still permeated the living areas, and on windy days, downdrafts could send smoke billowing back into the room. Additional chambers adjoined the main living space, providing separate areas for sleeping, storage, and sometimes specific work activities such as brewing or dairy production. The floors in these houses varied from packed earth in the most basic dwellings to brick or stone in more substantial homes, with wooden planking becoming increasingly common as the century progressed. Windows remained relatively small, their glass panes expensive enough that many houses still used oiled cloth or wooden shutters to cover the openings, though the presence of at least some glass windows had become more typical than in previous centuries. The light that entered through these windows created pools of illumination that shifted throughout the day as the sun moved across the sky, the quality of this natural light varying with weather conditions and seasons. Furniture in farming households reflected both practical necessity and the family's economic standing. Most homes contained a sturdy wooden table that served for food preparation and eating, surrounded by benches or stools that provided seating. Wealthier farming families might own chairs with backs and arms, these more comfortable pieces reserved for the household head or honored guests. Chests and cupboards held clothing, linens, and other household goods, their construction ranging from simple plank boxes to more elaborate pieces featuring carved decoration or paint. Beds had become more common than in medieval times, with wooden frames supporting rope or leather straps that held straw or wool-filled mattresses, the whole arrangement enclosed by curtains that provided both privacy and protection from drafts in unheated bedchambers. The agricultural year began its active phase in spring, when the warming weather and lengthening days signaled the time to prepare fields for planting.
Farmers guided their plow teams through the fields, the iron-tipped wooden plows cutting through soil that had been softened by winter rains and the first thawing of frost. The horses or oxen that pulled these plows moved at a steady walking pace, their hooves making soft thuds on the earth, while the plow blade made a continuous scraping sound as it moved through the soil. The smell of freshly turned earth, rich and slightly damp, filled the air around these working fields, mixing with the scents of grass beginning to green and early wildflowers blooming in the hedgerows and unplowed margins. Planting involved careful timing and attention to traditional signs that indicated when conditions were right for different crops. Wheat and barley, the primary grain crops, went into the ground when the soil had warmed sufficiently and dried enough to be workable, but before the late spring heat could stress the young plants. Farmers walked behind the plow, broadcasting seed by hand in rhythmic sweeping motions that distributed the grain evenly across the prepared ground. This work required skill developed through years of practice, as uneven seeding would result in patches of thin or overcrowded growth that could significantly reduce the eventual harvest. The seeds themselves came from the previous year's crop, with farmers carefully selecting and storing the best quality grain for this purpose, while using lesser grain for food or feed.
Kitchen gardens near the farmhouse received intensive cultivation during the spring months, as women and children prepared these plots for the vegetables and herbs that would supplement the family's diet throughout the growing season. These gardens typically included a variety of plants, with onions, leeks, cabbages, peas, beans, carrots, and various cooking and medicinal herbs arranged in organized beds that allowed for efficient tending and harvesting. The garden soil, enriched by years of composting household waste and animal manure, worked easily under hand tools and produced vigorous plant growth once the seedlings became established. The sounds of garden work, the scrape of hose on soil, and the quiet conversations of family members working together created a peaceful domestic atmosphere during these spring days. Livestock management represented a constant aspect of farm life throughout the year, though the specific tasks varied with the seasons. Most farms kept a mixed population of animals that included cows for milk production, sheep for wool and occasionally meat, pigs that could be fed on kitchen scraps and foraged food, chickens for eggs, and working animals such as horses or oxen. Spring brought the birthing season for many of these animals, with lambs and calves arriving during these months and requiring additional attention to ensure their survival. The sounds of young animals calling and the responses of their mothers created a distinctive soundtrack to springtime farm life, these vocalizations mixing with the general ambient noise of birds, the wind in trees, and the various activities of human labor. The dairy work that occupied much of women's time throughout the warmer months increased significantly in spring as cows freshened after calving and milk production reached its peak. Fresh milk required daily processing, as it would spoil quickly in the absence of refrigeration. Women skimmed cream from milk that had been left to stand in wide, shallow pans, then churned this cream to produce butter. The rhythmic sound of the churn's dasher moving up and down in its barrel, creating a familiar domestic rhythm. The remaining buttermilk served as a drink or cooking ingredient, while the butter itself, once formed, needed to be worked to remove excess liquid, shaped and stored in cool conditions. Cheese making represented another important use for milk, the process of curdling, draining, and aging, transforming this perishable product into a storable food that would last for months. Summer brought long days of work that began early and extended into the evening hours, taking advantage of the extended daylight to accomplish necessary tasks. The growing crops required regular attention, with weeding representing a constant obligation that continued throughout the season. Families moved through their fields with hoes and hand tools, removing unwanted plants that competed with the crops for nutrients, water, and space. This work proceeded methodically rather than quickly, as thoroughness mattered more than speed, and the hot sun during summer afternoons required workers to pace themselves to avoid exhaustion. The fields during midsummer showed dense growth, with wheat and barley stalks reaching toward their full height, and vegetable plants filling out the garden spaces with vigorous foliage. The hay harvest marked an important event in the agricultural calendar, typically occurring in June or early July, depending on weather and growing conditions. Hay provided essential winter feed for livestock, and the success of this harvest directly affected the farm's ability to maintain its animals through the cold months. Mowing the tall grass in meadows and fields designated for hay production required teams of workers moving in coordinated lines, their long-handled scythes swinging in rhythmic arcs that cut through the grass stems with distinctive swishing sounds. The cut grass fell in neat rows that needed to be turned several times over the following days to ensure even drying. This tedious work accomplished with wooden rakes and forks wielded by the entire family. The smell of drying hay, sweet and slightly dusty, dominated the farmyard during the hay harvest period, and the weather during these critical days determined whether the harvest succeeded or failed. Rain could ruin hay that had been cut but not yet dried, causing it to mold and become worthless as animal feed. Farmers watched the sky anxiously during this period, hoping for continued dry conditions until the hay had cured sufficiently to be gathered into ricks and stored. Once properly dried, the hay was loaded onto carts and transported to storage areas, where it was built into large stacks that would be drawn upon throughout the winter months. The sight of completed hay ricks dotting the landscape provided reassurance that adequate feed had been secured for the coming season. The grain harvest in late summer represented the culmination of the year's agricultural work and the moment that determined whether the farm would have adequate food and seed for the coming year. Wheat and barley matured at slightly different times, their stalks turning from green to golden as the kernels hardened and ripened. Judging the proper time to begin harvesting required experience and careful observation, as cutting too early meant immature grain with reduced nutritional value, while waiting too long risked loss from bad weather or birds. When the time came, harvest teams moved through the fields with sickles or scythes, cutting the grain stalks and gathering them into bundles called sheaths that were tied with twisted straw and stood upright in the fields to complete their drying. The grain harvest required all available labor, with entire families working from dawn until dusk during this critical period. The fields filled with activity, the rhythmic motion of cutting tools, the constant bending and gathering of cut stalks, and the voices of workers coordinating their efforts, creating an atmosphere of focused urgency quite different from the steadier pace of most farm work. The stubble left behind in harvested fields stood sharp and dry, crackling underfoot as people moved through the areas. Dust from the dry grain and straw hung in the air, coating workers and creating a parched sensation in throats and noses. The sun beat down on the exposed fields, its heat reflecting off the pale stubble and making the work physically demanding even for those accustomed to agricultural labor. Once the grain had been cut and dried, it needed to be transported to the farmyard for threshing, the process of separating the edible kernels from the surrounding chaff and straw. This work traditionally took place during the autumn and winter months when outdoor agricultural tasks diminished. Threshing involved beating the dried grain sheaths with wooden flails, hinged tools that allowed workers to strike the grain heads with controlled force. The steady rhythm of flails hitting the grain created a distinctive sound that echoed through farmyards during threshing time, a repeated thumping that could continue for hours as workers processed their harvest. The separated grain then required winnowing, accomplished by tossing it into the air in windy days so the lighter chaff blew away while the heavier kernels fell back down for collection. Autumn brought a variety of additional tasks beyond the grain harvest. Orchards required attention, with apples and pears reaching maturity and needing to be picked before wind or rot caused losses. The best fruit was carefully harvested and stored in cool, dark spaces where it might last for several months, while fruit with blemishes or damage was used immediately for cooking or cider making. Apple cider represented an important beverage in farming households, providing a relatively safe alternative to water and a use for fruit that might otherwise go to waste. The process of crushing apples and pressing out their juice, then allowing this juice to ferment into cider, created distinctive smells that pervaded the farmyard during cider making time, a sweet, sharp, yeasty aroma that signaled autumn as clearly as any change in the weather. Livestock management in autumn included selecting which animals would be kept through the winter and which would be slaughtered. This decision depended on several factors, including the amount of hay and other feed available, the age and condition of individual animals, and the farm's need for fresh meat. Animals selected for slaughter were typically processed in late autumn when cooler temperatures helped preserve the meat during the butchering process. The slaughtering and butchering represented significant events that required careful planning and skilled labor, as the entire animal needed to be processed efficiently to minimize waste. Fresh meat was consumed immediately by the farm family and sometimes shared with neighbors or sold, while much of it underwent preservation through salting, smoking, or being rendered into lard. The arrival of winter fundamentally altered the rhythm of farm life, as outdoor agricultural work largely ceased and activities shifted to focus on animal care, indoor tasks, and maintenance work. Daylight hours shortened significantly, and the weather often made travel and outdoor labor difficult or impossible. Farmers followed a more limited routine during winter months, rising later and retiring earlier in accordance with the natural cycle of light and darkness. The daily care of livestock continued regardless of weather, requiring multiple trips to barns and animal shelters to provide feed and water, clean living spaces, and check on the health and condition of the animals that represented significant investments for the farm. Indoor work filled the winter days, with repairs and maintenance tasks that had been deferred during busier seasons now receiving attention. Men repaired and maintained tools and equipment, sharpened cutting implements, mended harness and other leather goods, and worked on building projects or improvements to farm structures. Women focused on textile production, spinning wool or flax into thread, and weaving this thread into cloth on home looms, these processes requiring significant time and skill, but producing materials essential for clothing and household textiles. The sounds of the spinning wheel's steady hum and the rhythmic clacking of the loom created familiar background noises in farmhouse interiors during winter months. The winter diet relied heavily on stored foods accumulated during the productive months of the year. Root vegetables kept in cold storage provided fresh produce, while preserved meats, dried fruits, and the grain harvest formed the foundation of most meals. Bread remained the primary staple, baked regularly in the household or community oven from flour ground at the local mill. Pottage, thick soups or stews made from available ingredients, continued to serve as a common meal, the iron pot hanging over the kitchen fire and slowly cooking whatever vegetables, grain, and occasional meat could be added. Ale remained the standard beverage, brewed regularly by the women of the household using traditional recipes and methods that had been passed down through generations. Evening hours during all seasons followed similar patterns across most farming households. After the day's work concluded and the evening meal had been consumed, families gathered around the kitchen fire in the main living area. Conversations during these evening hours tended to cover practical matters, such as the next day's planned work, the condition of crops or animals, or business dealings with neighbors. Stories might be shared, particularly during the longer winter evenings, when there was more time for such recreational activities. Some households owned books, most commonly a Bible or other religious texts, and in families where someone could read, evening readings might provide both entertainment and spiritual edification. The firelight created a warm, dim atmosphere, shadows moving on the walls as the flames flickered, and the gradual dying of the fire served as a natural signal that the day was ending and sleep approaching. The social structure of rural England during the 17th century maintained clear distinctions between different classes of people, though the relationships among these groups were complex and varied by region and individual circumstance. Large landowners, whether gentry or nobility, controlled significant estates and held social and political authority in their localities. Below them existed a class of substantial farmers known as yeomen, who owned or held long-term leases on their land and often employed servants and laborers to work alongside family members. Below the yeomen came smaller farmers and cottagers who worked holdings that barely supported their families, and at the bottom of the rural social hierarchy stood landless laborers who worked for wages and lived in constant economic uncertainty. The parish church continued to serve as a central institution in village life, providing not only religious services, but also serving as a focal point for community identity and social interaction. Sunday attendance at church services represented a social expectation as much as a religious obligation, with the entire community gathering weekly to hear sermons, participate in prayers, and observe the rituals that marked the Christian year. The church building itself, typically the largest and most substantial structure in the parish, stood as a physical symbol of continuity and tradition, its stone walls and tower often centuries old and representing a direct link to earlier generations who had worshipped in the same space. Religious festivals and holy days provided periodic breaks in the agricultural routine, though the Protestant Reformation had reduced the number of such holidays compared to earlier Catholic practice. Christmas and Easter remained the most important celebrations, observed with special services, better food when resources allowed, and temporary suspension of regular work. Harvest festivals in autumn offered occasions for Thanksgiving and community celebration after the completion of the year's most critical agricultural work. These celebrations created memorable moments in what was otherwise a repetitive annual cycle, offering opportunities for community gathering, special foods, and relief from ordinary labor that provided both physical rest and emotional renewal. Market days and fairs provided regular opportunities for farmers to sell surplus produce and livestock, purchase goods they could not produce themselves, and interact with a wider community beyond their immediate neighbors. Most farmers lived within traveling distance of a market town, where weekly markets allowed for regular commerce and social interaction. The journey to market, whether on foot, horseback, or cart, became a familiar routine for those who participated regularly. The market itself created a bustling atmosphere, quite different from the quieter pace of farm life, with merchants calling out their wares, livestock being examined and bargained over, and crowds of people moving among the stalls and stands. The pattern of life described here represented a world that had evolved gradually over many generations, its basic structures and rhythms deeply familiar to those who lived within it. Most people spent their entire lives within a relatively small geographical area, their knowledge of the wider world limited to what could be learned from travelers' tales, occasional visits to larger towns, or reports of distant events filtered through multiple retellings. The routines of agricultural work, household management, and community participation created a framework of existence that provided both structure and meaning to daily life. This steady pattern of rural English farm life during the 17th century was an ordinary reality for the majority of the country's population during this historical period.